I want to provide voters an alternative option to the two-party system. It's our generation that has had to bear the burden the most of what these big government policies have been the last 20 years. So it's our generation that really needs to rise up and speak up for what we need going forward.
Your choice as the nominee was considered something of a controversial decision. How do you respond to people who think that you shouldn't have been the nominee?
I'm not going to apologize because I wore a mask when I visited people at a hospital or when I was at a business that required it. I'm not going to apologize for my own personal medical decisions. I've never been for lockdowns. I've never been for mandates. If I've been for anything, it's been for property rights.
Do you hope to abolish the Federal Reserve? Do you plan to remove all tariffs? Will the income tax be abolished? Sales tax, inheritance tax? Are we going back to the gold standard?
I would do all of those things if we could. I think the motivation is to further divide the party and make it seem like I'm a candidate who hates other libertarians, which could not be further from the truth.
Hello, and welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan, and I am the host of this series. The 2024 presidential election is in full swing, and many people have strong opinions about the two main candidates. Outside of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, however, there are in fact multiple, often overlooked third-party options, such as the Libertarian Party's own Chase Oliver. Chase has emerged as something of a polarizing, yet in many areas appealing option for those fed up with the uniparty's authoritarian policies and its illusion of choice. This is episode 25 of Morgan Meets the Eye, in which Chase responds to the misleading claims about his beliefs and actions and tells me about his plans for the country, in addition to the importance of libertarian philosophy in today's society. Hello, Chase. Thanks for coming on to the show. And although you've certainly been busy on the campaign trail, I know that there are plenty of people, even within the libertarian crowd, who don't know that much about you. So with this in mind, where should they go exactly to learn more about your platform and about your personal beliefs?
Yeah, well, if you want to check out the campaign and what we've been up to these last few months since the nomination, go to votechaseoliver.com. That's the best resource to really see the full scope of the campaign, our platform, our events, our media. And then, of course, if you are on social media, you can follow me at Chase for Liberty on all the major platforms. Chase, F-O-R, Liberty. I don't like to use the numbers. So, so those are the two places where you can learn the most about me and the campaign. Chase for Liberty and votechaseoliver.com.
So I do think that it is best that we start by basically understanding the man behind the campaign. So as a jumping off point, I do just want to ask, what motivated you to run for president in the first place?
Well, a lot of that had to do with the 2022 U.S. Senate race that I ran in the state of Georgia. I did a really good job, I think, of spreading the libertarian message. And once I forced the runoff, we got lots of national media attention. And so literally the day after I caused the runoff, we had libertarians calling me saying, hey, have you ever thought about running for president? And I was like, I don't know, that's kind of crazy. But after, a dozen or so call you, you can think maybe I should form an exploratory committee and kind of look into this. But really what motivates me to run for office to begin with is I want to provide voters an alternative option to the two-party system, which I feel lets us down way too much. And I want to represent the message of liberty, the philosophy of non-aggression, the philosophy of individual sovereignty, and that if you're not harming anybody, no harm should come to you. And so, generally speaking, I think we need great messengers. And I've always been somebody basically through my, maybe through my employment history. I've just had a really good job of speaking with people, both as a server for many years. So, talking directly with a customer, hitting the bottom line, being able to sell them on something. And then I moved from that into maritime trade. And so, it was a wonderful experience to be able to, hit the customer on the bottom line. And that, suited me really well for retail politics, being able to go one-on-one with voters and communicate very clearly and articulately what our message is.
I do see that what you're touching on there, you do speak upon what's going on with the two-party system and a lot of the issues that I think voters are currently facing with the status quo. We're seeing this now with a lot of the main political party candidates who are being essentially thrust upon us, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So in that case, I guess I'll just start by asking, why exactly are you a better option than either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris as presidential candidates?
Well, I think there's several factors. First, I do want to tout the libertarian philosophy. I think it is the strongest political philosophy, the one that's most in line with the principles that founded our country. But beyond that, I think I just through my lived experience have a experience that is much more in line with the average American. You know, I've had to work those 40 hours a week. I've had to make paycheck to paycheck, stretch that out. I see the pinch of inflation because I actually go to the grocery store and like a normal person. And I feel like too many times our politicians are far away from that. But beyond that, I'm somebody who's from a different generation. I'm from the millennial generation. And really, it's our generation that has had to bear the burden the most of what these big government policies have been the last 20 years. It's our generation that was sent to go fight the war on terror. It's our generation that had the entire economy fall out from underneath us right as we were getting started in like 2008. And it's our generation that's right now trying to raise families, trying to send their kids to school with a good education, trying to buy their first home, trying to get a quality job that provides for them and their family. And so it's our generation that really needs to rise up and speak up for what we need going forward. It's not about 2 years or 4 years. It's about 20 years and 40 years, because we're still going to be around, unlike the Donald Trumps of the world and many of the leaders in Congress and our current president of the United States. We're actually forward looking because we're going to be here. And we've actually had to bear the burden of what these people, the same people who were in charge today, were in charge 20 years ago. And so I think it's important for the Libertarian Party and alternative parties to bring about younger candidates with fresh perspectives and that are ready and willing to be the new leaders in this country, not the same old, and not the past generations. I say it's weird that we have a nation that's a vehicle of the 21st century and the drivers are all the 20th century. It'd be like if your computer today was running on Windows 95. That's the kind of government we have. And so we need to upgrade ourselves and really be more modern in our thinking. And we need that from younger candidates.
We are seeing, economic crisis after crisis just over the course of our lives here. It's something that I think we are affected by more deeply than a lot of these, elder candidates would be under those circumstances. I'm just curious, going on from there, what it is you see as the root cause of the issue here. What do you see as wrong with the American electoral system?
Well, there's a lot, and one of the biggest things that I address in my platform is the Voter Bill of Rights. And I think it hits a lot of these themes that we're talking about here of what's wrong with the system to begin with, that doesn't allow us to break out of this false binary of, left versus right or Democrat versus Republican. And a lot of that has to do with the hurdles people have to go through just to get on the ballot as an alternative party. It has to do with things like ranked choice voting, so that way we remove the so-called spoiler effect and can really have more civically engaged elections that aren't just about attacking one another. It involves things like proportional representation for the Electoral College, so that every state is a swing state, so that they don't take advantage of just red states and blue states and just don't even pay them any mind. It would allow for more competitive campaigns. Also regional campaigns, because you could have candidates winning congressional districts here and there. So that would allow third parties to have more of a foothold. Things like reducing the cost of running, the thousands and thousands of dollars in filing fees it takes. These are all artificial hurdles that are created by the state to limit the number of choices you have on the ballot. And the Voter Bill of Rights is a fantastic piece of the platform that helps address this. In fact, I want to give a shout out to the campaign that created it. It was not mine. It was Lars Mapstead, who's another fellow libertarian who was running for the nomination. And I felt, hey, out of all of his platform, that is the one that is the best idea that we need to keep pushing forward as a party. And so I'm proud to have endorsed the Mapstead Voter Bill of Rights, and I pushed for that as a candidate for president.
I'm actually very glad you touched on that, because I do want to speak upon, your relationship with the fellow candidates who are running for nominee in this election. Your choice as the nominee was considered something of a controversial decision. And I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on the controversy surrounding the nomination. How do you respond to people who think that you shouldn't have been the nominee? They may potentially point to perhaps some leaning towards certain policies that are considered too socially liberal for their standards.
Yeah, well, two things I would want to say. First and foremost, I've heard the idea that, I somehow won the nomination through a backroom deal with Mike Termott, who's my running mate. The truth is if you want to know how Mike Termott became my running mate, when he got knocked out of the race, I walked over and said, Mike, do you want to be my running mate? I think we could form a coalition ticket. And Dr. Rechtenwald's team also went to him, made the same deal, and Mike chose my team. That's literally the extent of it. It couldn't be any further from a back room. It was actually a quite public deal that I made with Mike Termott in the middle of the room. But that being said, my election, I understand there are people who are more socially conservative than me in the Libertarian Party. And what I have tried to do is actually run a very unified, libertarian message that, if I'm asked about these issues, I'm going to give my opinion on it. I think that's important to not have to run away from an issue. But what I've really focused on is the issues that are most important to Americans: inflation, immigration, war, medical, healthcare. These are the issues that are most important to Americans, most important to voters. So those are the things I try to stress. Now, if social issues were the main topic of discussion in an election, maybe there'd be a reason to question my policies. But the truth is my policies have always been live and let live. You may be more conservative than I am, and you may want to make a different decision in your life than I do. And I encourage you to exercise that, so long as you don't invade the civil liberties of other people. I think there's room enough in the tent for lots of people into the libertarian spectrum. That being said, I am who I am. And people knew who I was going into the convention, and the majority of delegates selected me. So that is the process that we have. I understand I might not be people's first choice, but I hope I'm people's first choice in November if you're a libertarian, because I am putting forth a very bold libertarian message. I've tried to form a unity ticket with Mike Termott, who is an Austrian economist, member of the Mises Caucus. And so what I've tried to do is my best is to unify the party. And I'm hoping members can see that I have, at least attempted to try to tone my message towards the broad libertarian spectrum, and not just focus on me as a candidate, but our party and our movement as a whole.
Yes, and I did actually meet your running mate, Mike Termott, face-to-face a couple of months ago at a Libertarian Party gathering in Rhode Island, and I do know that he has a fairly extensive background, both formally studying and working in the realm of economics. So just looking at that, looking in figures such as him, as well as others such as, Lars Mapstead, like you're mentioning, and Michael Rechtenwald, is there anything about your fellow libertarian candidates that has influenced your own platform, you would say, that has essentially persuaded you to take on specific positions?
I think there are different traits and qualities that, these guys, I say these guys because unfortunately we didn't really have any female candidates this time around, but these guys, I traveled across the country with them. I participated in dozens of debates, and you get to know them, and there are certain things you pick up from each of them. Sometimes it's policy positions, like with Lars Mapstead, right? Sometimes it's an entire other candidate in Mike Termott, and having to say, like, how can we blend his Golden New Deal platform with mine, which I think we've married quite well, and then maybe it's just the tone and quality. Like, I can tell you right now, Mike Termott looks great in a three-piece suit, and he's always shown me, like, hey, when the time comes for, like, the big times when you got to be in front of, like, a camera, like a debate stage, make sure you look your best, right? He's fantastic at that. When it comes to maybe, someone like, Josh Smith, who also ran, he's a bold anti-war messenger, and sometimes you just have to be unapologetically who you are. And I think he is somebody who's just like me, a regular working person who can connect with the average Joe. I think that is a quality he shares. There's little bits here and there of each of them, and I have learned a lot from each of them, honestly, as to how to campaign, how to communicate, and it was a good process. I think it's a good way to sharpen ourselves. I try to call each and every one of them after the convention. I spoke with most of them, and and said, just because I didn't, just because I happen to win doesn't mean I don't respect the fact that you put in a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And so I hope that I can continue to try to unify the party after November, and I hope those folks can be a part of that.
Now, I'm curious how big of a role, for example, you being, a member of the LGBT movement, how big of a role that has played in influencing your libertarian beliefs. If you think that that's something that's particularly integral to it, if you think that that is something that should be driving any liberty-minded person, because, for example, that may be a primary driving factor for you. Whereas my take, I personally have no issues with people who are in the LGBT movement. They should be treated with the same rights as any other person, as any other individual. But I'm just basically curious how, your own identity within this movement has influenced you. I do know, for example, that you were initially introduced to libertarianism through a stand at a Pride festival, for example.
Yeah, I was going to say that quite literally, me becoming a libertarian had to do with me being at the Atlanta Pride Festival and the Libertarian Party of Georgia being there as well, their candidate for governor. And they were the only political party that had their candidate for governor there that year, because Republicans were campaigning against us, and the Democrats, while they would pay us lip service, their candidate was too afraid to have like a rainbow flag behind them because they were scared they were going to lose votes in like the rural areas. And our candidate for governor, John Mons, was like, I don't care if I gain or lose any votes. I'm here on principle because I believe that you can love who you want to love as long as you're not hurting anybody. You can express yourself how you want to, like live your life, and that was very attractive to me. And as an individual who's part of that community, who has felt really ostracized, when I was in high school, I saw the government, essentially my president, George Bush, saying that me wanting to get married one day would lead to like the downfall of Western civilization, that if I could get married, then we'd be marrying dogs in 5 years, and all sorts of wild crap that like just did not really come to pass once same-sex marriage passed. But it did make me feel very isolated and alone, knowing that my president thought that I was somehow detrimental to the American dream. And the truth is we're not. And, as long as you're an individual who lives in peace with other people, you contribute to this world. You're a free individual, and you should be treated as such. And really, if you want to look at just the start of the modern gay rights movement, which was Stonewall in 1969, that was an action against police who were aggressing against people for no other reason. They were just being themselves and living their life in peace. And they fought back against that aggression from government, which to me is a very libertarian action. When the jackbooted thugs roll in and you fight back because your liberty is directly being assaulted by the government, that's a libertarian action. And so I think even the start of the modern gay rights movement, 2 years before we even had a Libertarian Party, was very liberty in nature. And so as an individual of that community, I kind of live through that lens and through the fact that my lived experience, and this, of course, is different. If you're not a member of the queer community, right? If you're not LGBTQ, this might not matter as much to you. It might be your identity as a gun owner, your identity as a Christian, your identity as a woman, your identity as a parent, your identity as a whatever it is that can form your liberty lens. But for me, that's a huge part of it, is that I can be who I want to be, love who I want to love, and live as I want to live. And by the way, libertarians, take note, if you want to fight back against the medical establishment, look at how ACT UP was during the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s. Like, watch the movie Dallas Buyers Club and see how people fought for their medical freedom at a time when it was really important and people were dying in the thousands and thousands from HIV/AIDS. So, like, there are lessons libertarians and the liberty movement itself can learn from that community and the way they've reacted to the way government has treated them throughout our history, which oftentimes is marginalizing them, marginalizing their voices. And when they learn how to unify and make themselves into a stronger political force, think about that. Like, LGBTQ people comprise not the largest portion of the population, but they have outsized political influence because they learned how to organize. They learned how to make their voice be a unified voice. And the liberty movement, frankly, could learn a lot of those lessons. And I think it would be important if we kind of look to that community as like, hey, how can we as libertarians grow from having 1% to 3% influence, which is like our size right now, to how can we outsize that influence and grow from there? I think there's lessons to be learned, certainly.
I do think that, unfortunately, this issue may be the thing that draws certain people, away from your campaign. And I mean this in the sense that, there are certain people within the libertarian movement who might be, obviously more socially conservative, and there might be some who just aren't drawn to that.
Well, no, and I think that might be a natural human instinct. Sometimes, like, just kind of a base instinct. But I think if we're going to organize and grow, we have to recognize that our liberty is dependent upon the liberty of other people too. That me as a free individual who is male, gay, Christian, white, whatever individual label you want to throw on me, I have to recognize that my liberty is just as valuable and just as important as anybody else who might be completely different than me. And that requires me to understand that I have to kind of put myself in the shoes of other people. And if we recognize that, we can kind of look at the motivations of other people, we can better understand and really, create a condition where more and more people will come to the idea of liberty. Like, I think that's really important, is to actually hear from all voices that we can, and not to marginalize or silence other voices. Like, that doesn't do that. What we're doing is showing that liberty is actually a universal value. It doesn't matter how you worship. It doesn't matter where you come from in terms of your nationality or cultural heritage. So long as you can come to the idea that if you live in peace, you can do that in accordance with other people who are living their life in peace, so long as we're not using the force of government upon us or violating the civil liberties of anybody else. Like, that is the ultimate message of liberty. And to achieve that end, we have to recognize that there's going to be a broad diversity of opinion, because we are a broad, diverse world. Even within our own towns and communities, there's lots of different ways people think, lots of different opinions. And we have to just recognize that in order for our liberty to function, their liberty has to function. And for our, for our ability to live our life unimpeded, we have to agree to let other people do that. And if everybody did do that, right? If everybody just agreed to live in peace with other people, there'd be no need for any government at all, at any level. We would just individually organize and come together when we need to, and form the communities and form the resources that we need to grow and survive and thrive. We would do that independent of the monopoly of force of government. Sadly, the world does not exist that way yet. But as long as we're going to continue to cut down government, we have to live by that example as much as possible in order to show that that is a possibility, and that we don't need the shackles of government upon us. We can release those shackles and still live in peace with one another. I think that's what's really important across. And so it's not about one person's identity politics. It's about recognizing that each and every person has an individual identity, and it all fits into the greater picture of liberty. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Having, established this, having laid this out, though, I do think we should move on to the next step, which is really, seeing talking about how certain voters have perceived your campaign, and basically trying to address any what could be very well misconceptions. For example, just getting into some of the controversies that people have attached to you. If I pull this up here, your statement in 2020 was, "I reject Ron Paul, and I am sorry, not sorry about it." So this is considered, something of a controversial statement. And, obviously, Ron Paul is seen as a hero by many people in the libertarian community, myself included. This is somebody who has been, very prescient in his observations about the soundness of money, about the war on terror. I do know back in, as soon as early 2011, he even said, if we don't pull out of Afghanistan by the end of this year, we'll probably be there for another decade or so. Sure enough, exactly a decade later in 2021, we had that disastrous withdrawal from Joe Biden. But basically, without going on here, I basically want to address, why exactly did you reject Ron Paul in that situation? What was your thought process there?
So allow me to, I'll explain this. And I want to say I've explained it elsewhere as well. So I'll be, not super drawn out about it. But the truth is that I do believe a picture can tell 1,000 words. It can certainly tell 1,000 words that aren't quite accurate to the situation. And if people had looked through my entirety of my social media searching the name Ron Paul, they would have seen many complimentary things, certainly since that post had been put out. But to explain that post in general, this was during the very beginning of 2020. I worked in maritime logistics, and we have offices all over the world, including in China. And we'd already lost employee family members to COVID at that point. And Ron Paul produced an article that said, "The coronavirus is a hoax," which to me says it's fake. And when I know people who had passed away from it, it kind of made me angry. I got hyperbolic. I felt that article was hyperbolic. I was hyperbolic, and I put that post out. And then like 2 weeks later, the entire world turned upside down. And had I even remembered I had posted that, I probably would have deleted it in the end. But I do that from time to time. I post something, go, "Oh, that was stupid," and I delete it. But the whole world turned upside down. COVID happened. Lockdowns happened. And in retrospect, a lot of the things that were written about in that article came to pass. And if you look again at the things I had said about Ron Paul after that, they've been very complimentary. And so to me, it's like, to judge me based on one thing that I've said is kind of silly. And I question why the people who circulated that post as much as they did also didn't circulate the good things I had said about Ron Paul. They wanted to make it seem like I just, absolutely only ever said bad things about him. And I think the motivations to do that is to further divide the party and make it seem like I'm a candidate who hates other libertarians, which could not be further from the truth. In fact, I was like in the third row center when Ron Paul was at our convention in Reno, or not Reno, but in DC this past convention, right there along with everybody else, cheering along to many of the things that he said that I very much agree with. And so I'm happy you gave me the chance to dispel that. And I hope libertarians who are voting, like seriously, if you're voting, and a tweet that I made that made you upset is causing you to change your vote to vote for somebody who's literally like Trump, who's been a war criminal, or even worse, Kamala Harris, who we know she's going to be one too, right? I urge you to really think about your priorities as a voter, because broadly speaking, I am as anti-war as Ron Paul has ever been, and I always will be. And if that is the most important thing, which I do believe, that and ending the stranglehold that our government has on our money and our monetary policy are the two most important factors. If those are the most important factors, make a statement and vote Libertarian. Do not abandon your vote to the two-party system that perpetuates the war, the Fed, and all of these other things.
I do know, for example, that you have also commended Ron Paul in certain situations as well. You've said that you wanted to adopt his policy of ending the Fed through auditing the Fed, as one particular example. Now, I think that some people, their particular issue might be that they find the language choice of rejecting Ron Paul to be maybe too strong in that particular situation. Do you think that in that case, you may have said too much, or you might have been too harsh on Ron Paul?
Yeah, as I said, I was being hyperbolic. And hyperbole is the enemy of nuance, and in 2020, you don't think that you're going to be, you're just an average Joe. It's not somebody who's trying to represent the will of the party. And certainly I wouldn't use that kind of language as a candidate who's representing the broad spectrum of the party. I think it's important to recognize the roles that people have. And when you're not just representing yourself, but you're representing your party on a ticket, on a ballot, it's important to be a little bit more safe and secure, and well, not safe and secure, but more considerate is the word I'm looking for, of your language, in particular, to make sure that you're not, misrepresenting the party. And so I think I've tried to do that as a candidate. And yeah, I would say that was hyperbolic. And I think, at the time he had written a headline that I thought was hyperbolic, and I was hyperbolic in response. I'm an individual. We're not perfect. But again, I think if that is swaying your vote, I hope that what I just said can assuage you to say, I'm going to reject the war machine. I'm going to reject the Fed. I'm going to vote Libertarian.
One thing I noticed you were speaking on in your initial, disagreement with Ron Paul was in regards to the COVID lockdown. And I'm sure you are well aware that there are certain controversies attached to you regarding COVID. Now, what I've seen here is that there seems to be some type of a discrepancy between people seeing that, you've worn masks, and they have come to believe that, you supported, the government's actions during this. To give you one particular example, I do know Jeffrey Tucker spoke negatively after a certain article that Reason published about you, and his exact words were, if I pull these up right here, he said, "Not one word on the candidates' pro-lockdown, pro-mask, pro-mandate views. This guy only came out against lockdowns 20 months after they were imposed, and only because of Pax Lovid." What is your response to these claims, and how can you assure Americans that you will not resort to these same measures if another pandemic similar to COVID were to occur?
First off, I've never been for lockdowns. I've never been for mandates. And if I've been for anything, it's been for property rights. And so if you see a picture of me wearing a mask, which the most famous one that you see online is me outside of a store called Wax and Facts and Little 5 Points. And what was I doing there? I was running for office. In 2020, I was running for Congress representing the Libertarian Party. And if I wanted to walk into that store or walk into any store in that area of Atlanta, I had to be wearing a mask. And not just because the government said so. A lot of that had to do with the property owners wanting you to wear a mask when you came in. And hey, if it means I'm respecting their property rights, I'm going to do that. But my own personal medical decisions have nothing to do with what the government mandates or the government decides. I will always stand up for any individual's right to wear whatever they want to wear, take whatever circumstances to take care of themselves they want to. If you want to wear a mask, wear a mask. If you don't want to, you don't want to, as long as a property owner isn't requiring that. If a property owner does, you have to respect property rights. The same with a vaccine. You want to get vaccinated, get vaccinated. You don't want to get vaccinated, don't get vaccinated. If a business wants to require vaccinations and they're going to lose out on really good employees who chose not to get the vaccine, that's the loss of that business. It's the way the market works. Similarly, if you're a business who, that is up to a business to decide and you to decide where you move into the marketplace. And as imperfect as that is the way the free market is supposed to work. That's the way property rights are supposed to work. But never will I say the government should force those things. The government should never be using the monopoly of force to control your bodily autonomy and the decisions you make about them. And I've spoken out against that. And this idea that because I wore a mask where it is required by a property owner that somehow means I'm a dupe of the state is kind of ridiculous to me, because I've always stood against the state requiring me to do anything. I've always said, if a property owner wants me to do this, I will do it. If I feel like the need to do it and that sacrifice is worth me going there. And that's ultimately how I feel about the process. And if I were president, I would rely on individuals to make decisions for themselves. I would ask them to talk to their family doctor and not rely on me, the President of the United States, to give them medical decisions. I don't have a medical degree. That's not my job. My job is to make sure that I'm executing laws in a constitutional manner and cutting down the state, not to be everybody's doctor or their nurse. You should be making those determinations about yourself, your family, not me. And so I understand. People try to make that into a controversy. But if you really looked at the statements that I made in public, including in a U.S. Senate debate, I've always talked about healthcare freedom and the freedom from mandates and not having to be required to do these things. And so I don't know how much more public I can be as a candidate about that. But no, I'm not going to apologize because I wore a mask when I visited people at a hospital or when I was at a business that required it. And I'm not going to apologize for my own personal medical decisions. I just know that I'm not going to ever ask to make medical decisions for you or anybody else because it's not my business.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. So in this case, I'm noticing that as far as a lot of these controversies surrounding you, they seem to be, at least I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but they do seem to be some type of manufactured misinformation, really.
Yeah, something like, I'm trying to look for the word, but, basically like they are meaning to not understand on purpose. Because if you really look at the full spectrum of things, like I just saw today, I put out an October 7th message saying, hey, October 7th happened, a lot of people died, and now there's a bunch of wars going on and a bunch of people are dying. And people are saying, Jason's a dupe for Israel. He just backs Israel all the time. It's like, if you look at every other statement I've made about Israel and Gaza, it would be very hard to draw that conclusion. And to me, that is intentionally trying to misrepresent via one single tweet or one single message to try to divide. And we have to think about who would benefit from trying to divide the Libertarian Party. Why would people do that? And it's because, frankly, they don't want votes to go to the campaign. They feel like there's a two-party candidate they'd rather support. And that's their right, but it's not right for them to misrepresent somebody's record, especially when there's tons of evidence to the contrary. And I shouldn't have to be spending my time, certainly from libertarians, having to relitigate my personal beliefs. If I'm a libertarian, I'd rather spend a lot more time reaching out to folks who don't know about libertarianism, who don't know about the message of liberty, providing them an alternative on the ballot. And so for me, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I think a lot of times it takes away from the broader campaign. And that's a shame that we have to spend time doing that because most people who know me go, yeah, Chase is libertarian as can be. Like, ask any regular, normal person in my life who's not part of the party and say, name two things about Chase. And they'll say, he likes Star Trek and he's a libertarian. Like, that's probably the top two things someone's going to say about me.
Somebody might take something, they might twist it and essentially jump on it in a certain way. For example, I've seen comments recently you were making in regards to FEMA, in relation to the hurricane that has been striking this country. Mm-hmm. And, I see some people essentially trying to twist that as to some type of support of the state in this case, in the idea that the state should be above some level of criticism.
Yeah, that's funny to me is because all I was doing was saying, listen, these reports that FEMA's out of money because we bailed out a bunch of immigrants is just not true. If you look at the way the government is funded, which I think if you want to tear down the state, it's important to know how it operates and exactly how the money gets into the hands of these different organizations and these different departments. If you look at the way it was funded, it doesn't have anything to do with hurricane preparedness. And that was just anti-immigrant sentiment to try to pass border control, how to try to pass status controls on the movement of people, which I happen to be against. I happen to be for the 21st century Ellis Island. And I felt the need to say that. Now, that doesn't mean that FEMA is a great organization. It doesn't mean that in a perfect world, I think they should ever exist. They shouldn't. We should decentralize those kinds of things down to the most local government possible, and particularly individuals like charities, NGOs, and nonprofits to be able to facilitate these things better. Like if we could take all the billions of dollars we've given FEMA and give that to non-governmental organizations, they would do so much better. They would have allocated those resources so much better. That being said, FEMA exists today. They're doing their terrible job that they're going to be doing on the ground because they're inefficient as a bureaucracy. It doesn't mean those people hate the people on the ground. I think that's the thing is like there are certain cases of maliciousness in government. And there are certain cases of just, ineffective governance. I think the people who work at FEMA legitimately want to try to help people. They're just stuck in a terrible government system. And if you ended FEMA tomorrow, I bet you those FEMA workers would find another charity organization or aid organization to work with within the private marketplace. It's like education. If we got rid of private education tomorrow, public education tomorrow, all those teachers who are public school teachers, they would probably become a teacher somewhere else. They'd figure out another school to go to. The market would provide an opportunity for them to be an educator. Similarly, if we got rid of FEMA tomorrow, all those FEMA workers would probably be, part of an individual aid organization. We can argue why that's better, why that's more efficient, why that would help more people without, being false about the way it's funded or what's happening on the ground. I think it's important to be clear and transparent, because if you're going to ask people to step outside the two-party system, which for them provides a winner half the time for them, right? If you're going to ask them to step outside that and trust you, you have to be trustworthy, and you have to be willing to be transparent with things and try to be as forthright with true information as possible. And so when you start seeing rumors like that, it's important to clear that up and say, FEMA shouldn't exist anyway. But the idea that it's terrible because immigrants got all the money is stupid. No, FEMA is bad because it's an inefficiently run bureaucratic organization that has lots of problems. And I've seen it in my adult life since Katrina onward. But no, it's not because the immigrants are taking all the money. That is allowing immigration to be the excuse for why FEMA doesn't function, and not the fact that it's because it's a giant bureaucratic mess that's centrally planned by our federal government. And so I felt it important to both clarify that and in other statements, criticize FEMA's actions on the ground and their ability to not be as organized as they should, and also shouting out organizations that have done great work. In fact, I'm going to be doing a live stream later this week with somebody who has been on the ground, pulling bodies out, like helping people and rescuing people. And I want to tell their stories too. I think it's important. But the idea that I'm simping for FEMA just because I'm saying, no, you don't give the excuse that FEMA is bad because the Mexicans took all the money, which is what you're seeing online on X. No, FEMA is bad because FEMA is bad. And we can talk about immigration later. But right now, disaster response. That's the most important thing.
I do want to stop essentially belaboring these quibbles and twistings of words here and kind of move on to the issues formally. So basically, I think one thing that I have noticed is that a lot of these issues seem to come from almost a tension between yourself and the Mises Caucus. Now, what I find interesting is that, when I hear about the Mises Caucus, and I want to be clear, I have no particular issue with them. But I do know that, one of their most famous affiliates, Dave Smith, for example, he is somebody who has, in regards to immigration, made some controversial views in libertarian circles, where he has said that basically, the military should be put at our southern border to essentially prevent, the type of immigration that is going through currently. So I think from here, I kind of want to seg towards the issue of immigration specifically. There is a debate, within libertarian circles over whether we should have open borders or closed borders. Now, my particular take on this is that people are often looking at this in the wrong context. I mean, to quote Milton Friedman, he's spoken on, a nation can have open borders and it can have a welfare state, but it cannot have both. And I feel like this principle really does apply here. So I would say that in this case, we see the Democratic Party. They essentially try to have both. The Republican Party claims that they don't want either, but I do think that they often compromise in many cases and still end up with both. I see that the welfare state is very much an infringement upon individual liberty. I feel like it necessarily has to be. Open borders, I don't see that as a problem. I don't see, somebody coming into this country, as long as they're not infringing upon private property, I don't see that as any particular issue. I'm curious what your take on this would be in regards to immigration and how we should essentially present this as a nation founded on libertarianism.
So I think it's important for us to just look at the facts on the ground. So I support a 21st century Ellis Island. I think if you want to come here to work, excuse me. I think if you want to come here to work, you should basically come through a port of entry, declare who you are, do a quick background check and health check, and get documentation to work. This would bring whole communities out of the shadows. It would quit driving down wages. It would actually have, a net effective, law enforcement can actually focus on people who are still trying to sidestep that program because they want to engage in human trafficking or something else. And so I think there's a lot of benefits to that kind of platform. But I think it's important to understand that immigrants actually contribute to this economy. If you look at a study from Rice University in Texas, Texas has the second highest number of undocumented / illegal immigrants, whatever terminology you want to use. And they have the second highest population in the country. And if you look at the study they put out there, Rice University shows that actually they created a net tax surplus when they came here and worked, because they pay into the system that they can't ever collect from in terms of Social Security with their fake Social Security cards. They pay property tax via their rent. That's passed on to them. Taxes get passed on to the end consumer. That's even the renter. They pay sales tax. They pay all kinds of taxes when they come here. And so they actually net contribute and don't deplete the welfare as much as you might be led to believe in many cases. And in fact, it's kind of near basically zero. It was $400 million is what they created to the surplus. So it's basically near zero, because when you're talking in millions and giant government budgets, what have you. But at the end of the day, we have to understand that immigrants don't just like sit on a fixed economic pie and eat from it. They grow the economic pie. They actually create jobs. And if we facilitated where they had documentation and ease of that, streamline that process, A, the immigration system itself would be less expensive. You wouldn't have to have so much of a cost at our southern border. And B, if with people with legal status, they would get to work starting a business, and they wouldn't be getting a job that drives down the wages because they're competing on the same legal open playing field as anybody else. They don't have to be forced into paying pennies on the dollar because, hey, you don't like it, you can go back home, or we'll get you deported, we'll report you. It would also lead to more movement for seasonal labor. You know, if you're an agricultural worker, you would come here during planting and harvesting. And instead of right now, where you send most of your money back home to your family and you stay stuck here living on welfare or charity, you would basically go back home with your money, and you'd be able to spend that with your family in the off season, where that dollar is going to go way further. And so it would create a better system altogether. But we have to understand that immigrants are not the most giant drain on the economy. The welfare state is, but it's not just because of immigrants. And in fact, immigrants are a very small part of that. And we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can have a libertarian policy on immigration while also fighting for a libertarian policy on things like welfare, removing that from the governmental role and returning that to charities, mutual and direct aid, which is where it belongs, where it's going to be best allocated. And we can make those cases at the same time. I believe libertarians are smart enough to do both. And so I think we can advocate for ending the welfare state while also advocating for the free movement of labor, capital, people, without this closed border, which would require, as you said, the military to be on our southern border. That's a huge expansion of the state. And frankly, I don't think that's a good use of the military. And it's not a world I would want to live in, to have a giant militarized southern border. That sounds like something out of East Germany. I think we as libertarians and we as Americans can provide a better path forward, and one that's rooted in the idea of liberty, while also fighting against this giant welfare state and saying, hey, we don't think government should be doing this because it's an inefficient way to help our fellow man. We can help our fellow man better in a decentralized manner through mutual and direct aid and through charity and voluntarism. And I think we can make those cases simultaneously.
Just the very existence of the welfare state, too, does tend to distort this issue quite a bit. It does tend to incentivize immigration. It does tend to essentially distort, you know, who would be coming here and what their particular motives for that might be.
Yeah, but they have they have actually an even larger welfare state in Canada. But there's a reason why they stop here and they don't keep going north. It's because they have better opportunity here. There's a better marketplace here. There's more freedom here. And there's a reason why we're not all fleeing to Canada for their great welfare state either. It's because it's inefficient. It doesn't work great. And so I think, you know, I understand that there's a draw for some people, maybe for welfare. Maybe some people are like, hey, I'm going to go there to get my food stamps. I'm going to travel 1,000 miles through the desert or whatever to get there. But I think the incentive for, by and large, for most immigrants is they want to come here and work and build and contribute and start something and make their own money in a way that they can't do back home, because there's just not that chance for prosperity, or there's not that safe place where you can raise your kids that you can in the United States. And much of that has to do with our drug war, by the way, and our destabilization of the region through the CIA and intelligence agencies toppling governments in Central and South America. And so, you know, as much as we like to say, hey, it's not our fault people are coming here north looking for prosperity, there's really a lot of reason why actually we're contributing to much of the misery south of our border. And if we stopped a lot of those practices, you know, maybe we could talk about that. And I think we can also do that simultaneously while having free and open immigration and fighting the welfare state.
Now, some people might cite particular examples outside of the U.S. They might point to perhaps more ancient history. For example, I've seen some people say that due to the fact that the Western Roman Empire, for example, was essentially collapsing, it essentially collapsed due to the mass migration of the Germanic tribes of that time. And they might cite that as an example that for this reason, if we leave this type of mass migration completely unchecked by any type of measure, this could potentially lead to problems as well. And I feel like this is where a lot of these people from the side where they'll say that, you know, where they put being pragmatic over being principled, they may say that for this reason, we should not particularly just allow immigration as, without any checks at all.
Yeah, I also think it's important that culturally we recognize that part of, I hate to say American exceptionalism, rah, rah, wave the flag, but part of what has made us such a powerhouse economy is that we have kind of imported so many people from around the world. We've kind of imbued their culture into our great melting pot, and then we make that as part of Americanized culture and export it outward. And so that's one of the reasons why American culture can so easily kind of be adapted by everywhere else around the world. It's because we've kind of adapted everywhere else around the world into our melting pot. And so I think that's one of the things that actually makes us strong as a nation. We're not as homogeneous as most of the, we have a lot of diversity, and that's actually a powerful thing in a free market, because when you have a diverse market portfolio, you're exercising from a much stronger position. And that's true as far as cultural, the different cultural heritages and all the different kind of ideas and innovations that we have, because we have so many different ways of thinking here. I think that's something to celebrate, actually. I think that makes us stronger. And it could be because I live in a city that is hugely diverse. And I recognize not everybody has the same lived experience that I do. But when I see like all the different cultures coming together in like the city of Atlanta, it's a beautiful thing. It makes some beautiful music, you know what I'm saying? And so I think that's important too, that liberty allows for that. We are exceptional for that, I think.
This kind of leads me to another issue I wanted to talk about. And I feel like this is an issue that, the main candidates as well, Trump and Kamala, have not been speaking on sufficiently. And that's actually the matter of energy. So I've noticed that in a manner similar to immigration, one matter that's getting dragged to the forefront of modern discourse, essentially, is energy, cleanliness, and efficiency. Now, of course, there obviously does appear to be some level of tension between clear energy and efficient energy on the surface level. That is according to what the people pushing the energy regulation and legislation present as supposedly clean energy. So what I mean by this is that if we take the people calling for, let's say, the Green New Deal as an example, what they're calling for is a very widespread and a very extensive governmental control that is going to impact virtually everybody in the nation on a personal level. But if we put that aside for the moment, the Green New Deal excludes nuclear power, explicitly, because they claim that it presents a danger to the environment. And I mean, I can cite, for example, official statements concerning the Green New Deal, where the U.S. government explicitly does claim that it does hope to transition off of nuclear power as soon as possible. And in fact, the deal's proponents are actually hoping to do it within the next 10 years. Now, what I find that many of these legislators are overlooking is that nuclear energy is actually better for the environment, and it's also less financially burdensome precisely because of how much more energy it can produce compared to a lot of these other options, such as solar or wind, that they're championing. So, for example, as far as whether or not, nuclear energy is actually fit to combat the threat of climate change, these statistics do show that nuclear energy has actually lowered, a lot of carbon dioxide emissions by, I believe the statistic was about 60 gigatons or so over the past half century. And for that matter, if we can look to the World Nuclear Association. I do know that they've cited as well that, today's use of nuclear power has actually reduced emissions that are equivalent to just removing about 1/3 of the entire world's cars, the entire globe, that is.
Yeah.
So I could go on and on with examples to put this into perspective, but I'm just curious about what is your plan in regards to energy? And at the heart of that, what is your personal stance on being energy efficient?
Yeah, I think we want to see clean air, clean water, right? We want to see efficient energy use. And you're right. I think nuclear actually for way too long has actually had its hands tied. It's been overregulated and had too much red tape. And if you look at the modern nuclear technology, if we're not going to put that in the portfolio of the future, you're not being serious about wanting to reduce carbon. Like, that's just being realistic. We need nuclear energy if you're somebody who wants to reduce carbon in the air. And I think we need nuclear energy if you're somebody who wants to have cleaner air and water in the future. There's several advantages to it. First off, you can use small modular reactors today to power small towns and cities with a much smaller land use footprint than, say, wind farms or solar farms, and you don't have to mine a ton of lithium to produce it. You can use nuclear power using thorium salt reactors to actually use processed nuclear waste and reprocess that and use that for power. And so there's a way to actually even reuse the old nuclear waste that we have, which, by the way, all the nuclear waste we've ever produced fits into a much smaller land use than, again, the amount of land you would have to mine to get all the solar cells, or the amount of land placement you have to use for the solar cells. And so I think in a true free market race for energy, nuclear has a huge advantage, and would in the long run if we undid the regulation and red tape around it. That just is unneeded, because politicians are thinking like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. They're thinking about things from 50 years ago. That'd be like if they were trying to regulate car safety of today using cars from 50 years ago. Look how much safer cars are today. It's because we've innovated, we've moved forward. The same as with nuclear technology. And so my policy, if I were president, is first off, to remove all subsidies for all energy. The energy we subsidize the most is coal, oil, and natural gas. And so reduce all those subsidies at all, remove them all, and let them openly compete on the free market. And I think consumers will ask for cleaner choices. They'll ask for nuclear, they'll ask for wind and solar to be part of that portfolio as well, and possibly natural gas as a transitionary fuel to get us ultimately over the hump where we can fully nuclear power this nation. But again, government shouldn't be picking those winners and losers. Individual consumers should be making those decisions. And I think they're going to want a cleaner, better future via nuclear power. And I think it's a huge mistake when these people on the left, the Green Party, for example, tries to think that they're going to power the future without using nuclear power. It's just the math does not math there. And so it's not being realistic. And it, frankly, to me, is just a sign of how unserious some of these folks really are about having cleaner air and cleaner water. And I'll speak on one more thing. I spoke to a lot of farmers in Iowa and South Dakota who were upset about these carbon sequestration pipelines that they're trying to build through land via eminent domain. It's because they think, hey, we'll take the carbon from these coal plants, we'll put them through a pipeline, we'll shoot it down really far into the earth, and it'll sequester it. Well, that works great until a pipeline breaks and you spew a bunch of CO2 in the air that'll cause people to get very sick. It'll cause cars to stop running. It can cause people to have brain damage, which is what we saw in Setorsha, Mississippi. And to eminent domain this, to be building a pipeline within 400 feet of people's homes, is completely ridiculous. And for the just one more fact, you use as a quarter of that coal-fired power plant's energy just to power the pipeline. So you've just made that coal-fired power plant, which is already putting carbon in the air or being inefficient, even more inefficient by building the damn pipeline. And so let's be realistic about these things, and let's unleash the power of nuclear instead of trying to pass tons of subsidies to give to energy companies to eminent domain land in Iowa and South Dakota to build carbon sequestration pipelines.
Even beyond the level of, how functionally unsound this idea is, if we look at just the economic impact, the financial lack of viability to this idea of allowing the government to essentially control which forms of energy, businesses and private citizens are allowed to use. I know that the team behind the Green New Deal has claimed that they can pay for this idea through multiple routes. Predominantly, their plan has been listed as using the Federal Reserve to extend credit. We can safely conclude that these people are in very much opposition to Ron Paul. But they also plan to essentially create new government-run public banks that can also extend credit. And, since this in itself may also not be enough to actually cover it, they've also refused to rule out a carbon tax. I do know that the Carbon Tax Center has simultaneously endorsed the Green New Deal, and they've also explicitly said that a very large carbon tax wouldn't be enough to actually reach the emission reductions that, the International Panel on Climate Change, if I believe their name is, says are going to be required to do this. And, what I think is certainly ironic here is that, banning this nuclear power will, in fact, increase emissions. I do know that there was something of an experiment in Vermont, ironically enough, the home of the notorious Green New Deal supporter Bernie Sanders. I do know back in 2005, the state of Vermont's legislators, in fact, they claimed that just by exclusively using renewable energy and by rejecting nuclear power, I do know that they said that the state would have emissions levels that were 25% lower than they were in 1990 by the year 2012. And then from there, they would be 50% lower by 2028. And of course, that's not what the trends have ended up demonstrating. Since then, Vermont's emissions have actually risen at twice the level of the rest of the nation's average during that same time period. And yes, I do know there are also plenty of other statistics that show how badly this attempt to cut down on emissions has backfired. But my point here is that the U.S. is currently just in no position at all to get rid of nuclear energy.
Oh, well, and one more thing about energy efficiency, and if you want to get rid of carbon, you want to get rid of a lot of the carbon use in the United States. We should cut down on the greatest user and emitter of carbon in this country, and that's the United States military and our foreign interventionism around the world. We spew tons of carbon in the air when we fly jets and tanks and all sorts of weapon systems. And if we removed that mission from being a militaristic empire around the world and instead focused on just protecting the homeland, we could cut down a lot of that carbon use. So I encourage these Green New Dealers to actually become back to being an anti-war folks. We used to have an anti-war left in this country. I guess they disappeared because a guy named Barack Obama got elected. And so maybe we need to return to that, and we can entice them by saying, see, we're cutting down on carbon when we stop killing innocent people overseas via our drone warfare and our militaristic empire. Maybe that's what it will take to get the left finally about being anti-war again. It's not the dead people, it's the carbon use. That's what we need to do. Let's focus them on that, and maybe they'll come to the idea that being anti-war is a good thing again.
And what you're touching on there is kind of a theory I've long held in regards to the way that one of the big flaws of our two-party system, and I believe that we've reached a point where this nation is so divided that they seem to be almost saying something just to say the opposite of what the other side is taking. For example, the left was once, like you're saying, very much anti-war, but now they're seeing, they might see the other side for taking a particular stance. So just to spite them, it almost seems that they're going to now become pro-war, just indirect conflict with them.
Two parties of contrarianism. It's one of the reasons why I urge libertarians not to just be, reflexively contrarian to things, to actually be a skeptic, to always question authority and question the narrative, but don't just by reflex be a contrarian. I once said, hey, if the government one day said, don't jump off the bridge, some libertarians would do it just to spite them, even though that's one of the times when, maybe they say a broken clock is right twice a day. And so, yeah, always be questioning the narrative, always be a skeptic, but don't be a blind contrarian, because otherwise you're going to end up being just as lacking in principles as the two-party system is. I think that's one of the reasons why the two-party system is such poison, is because it creates that false binary. And so as libertarians, reject it. Be libertarian, be principled, fight for those things, and don't just be against something just because someone is for it, and vice versa. Stay true to your principles. And I think that's how we're going to really grow ourselves moving forward and gain the trust of the voters.
I think we saw that very clearly during the COVID pandemic, for an example. We saw a lot of people who, let's say the left, who for once, who was at one point in time very much against, just going along with what the government was telling them, let's question this authority. But then, during this pandemic, where we see a lot of the people who they were up against, now standing against the government, saying, standing in opposition, it's almost as though, for the sake of having these two opposing forces, there was some type of obligation on their part, really, to now, essentially just go along with whatever the government's narrative was on that particular issue.
That's the nature of two-party politics. It's the evil that we have to slay. That's why we have to change the way we vote. So we have to expand more choices and more voices. And of course, let's start electing libertarians. Can we please not get as economically as desperate as Argentina was before we elect a libertarian president? I am challenging the American voter, the American people. Let's do it sooner.
There was an issue I wanted to speak with you about as well, and that is the issue of education. I do know that you've stated that you want to decentralize education, and I do think that's certainly a step in the right direction. I know that, namely, you want to abolish the U.S. Department of Education, which I certainly agree with. And putting aside for a moment just the Orwellian nature of a government-run Department of Education, I do think we should really dissect what this organization is. This was founded back in the late 70s. I believe it was 1979 during the Carter administration. And, what this necessarily means is that this country flourished for over 200 years without any Department of Education. And since then, it has become crystal clear that the state of education in the U.S. has almost catastrophically deteriorated. Once we adjust for inflation, for example, I do know that college prices have more than tripled since the early 1960s. And what's interesting, though, is that from that period in the early 1960s up to the founding of the Department of Education, prices were actually very steady. They might make minor occasional fluctuations upward and even downward in many years. But since this department was founded, naturally the prices have exclusively increased. It has increased every single year since the department was founded, and it's been increasing at a completely unprecedented rate as well. And this is obviously to say nothing of the terrible state of public schools. But in any case, what is your personal stance on education, and why should the Department of Education be abolished?
Well, as you said, it's a giant waste of money. Like, you don't see the results coming out of the billions and billions of dollars we put into it. And if there was any proof that it actually worked, it'd be a lot harder to fight against it. But the proof is not in the pudding. There's not really any great increase in reading and writing and critical thinking skills from our students as a result of the Department of Education. I think it actually ties the hands of lots of states. It kind of standardizes things from the top down, which isn't very helpful. And so, yeah, I would seek to get rid of it. Now, we live in a world where right now taxes are being used to fund education. And again, in the libertarian ideal, all taxes we'd be able to do this at the community level, what have you. But so long as taxes are being used, they should be used to fund the student, not the system. Fund the student directly so the parent and the students can find the best education choice for them. If you live in a place that has great public schools today, I'm betting you're still going to fund that same school building. They already have the building and the infrastructure and the bus routes and all those things. You'll keep funding that. But if you live in Atlanta, where the teachers and administrators were caught cheating and got arrested on RICO statutes for cheating on tests to up their funding, maybe if you're a parent there, you go, maybe I should move my money elsewhere. I should send my child elsewhere. They're going to get a better education from an independent school, a private school, religious school, parochial school, what have you. So for me, the free market of education ultimately it seals the cracks that too many students are falling through today. And I know exactly how that feels as being a student that had ADHD in high school, that wasn't properly, that was, over-medicated as a kid, didn't get proper therapy. And it was really tough for me in school. And I guarantee you, if there had been alternative forms of education that had me working with my hands and actually being out there and doing the thing, as opposed to sitting in a classroom, like twiddling my leg like a crazy person when you have ADHD, I probably would have paid more attention. But I would have only had that opportunity if my parents could have funded a different school, and they just didn't have that ability. And so when we do this, we unlock the ability not just for alternative schools, but also homeschooling. Maybe you live in a two-parent household, and one of the parents can actually stay home now and educate the kids because they have the funding to do so as a homeschool parent. And that's your choice you want to make. All of these things are better because when you create a more broad spectrum, just like any other free market, you're going to create a diversity that allows more people to find what works best for them and fits them in the right place. And that's what we need for our kids. We need to be creating generations of critical thinkers, lifelong learners, people who want to always, question what we can do better and more efficiently and how we can innovate in the world. And we're only going to get that when we decentralize education. I also have a student loan plan that gets the government out of student loans altogether to help fight that inflationary practices at our colleges and universities you were talking about as well. And it's not just a giveaway like the Democrats want to do. And so I urge people to check out my website and see that as well. But ultimately, we want to bring back free market economics to education.
I believe I've heard that you were discussing something about removing interest rates from certain loans that are being paid back.
Yeah, so 90% of government or 90% of student loans today are backed by the federal government. And what I would seek is legislation that does a couple of things. First, it would make all currently government-backed student loans interest-free as of today, so people can pay down their principal and we can get that loan off of the government's balance sheet. You would pair that with no new government loans, so we're not adding anything to the balance sheet. And to make up for the loss in revenue that the banks would have, you would cut Pentagon spending to make up that loss so that the banks aren't losing out either. To keep the system solvent, to move our system in the direction, it would also be revenue neutral in that case. And you can move ourselves in the direction of actual free markets being in control of the pricing of our institutions of higher learning. And you do that in a transitionary way that allows people to get out from under the trap right now where they're paying that minimum payment. And they pay like 3 times as much as the degree is worth to finally get rid of the student loan. Let's let them pay down the principal. Let's remove that debt from as many Americans as we can so they can start a business, so they can start a family and actually contribute to the American economy as opposed to backing the American tax coffers. Let's get the government out of the business of student loans so that way we can bring back market practices. And again, you do this by making it revenue neutral. You do this by not giving away anything to anybody other than letting them pay down their principal. And you do this by pairing that with no new government-backed student loans.
I have a theory that a lot of the drive to keep property taxes in place, for example, which fundamentally are taxes on goods that one already owns, to be clear, and I would say are fundamentally unjust as a result. But basically this desperate need to keep property taxes in place and to avoid lowering them is actually to fund these schools, since the bulk of taxes for public schools do come from the property tax. But this also kind of leads me to another issue I wanted to speak on, and that's basically economics in general. So when you call for less government intervention in the economy, as your campaign very explicitly does, What do you mean by this specifically? Do you hope to abolish the Federal Reserve? Do you plan to remove all tariffs? Will the income tax be abolished? Sales tax, inheritance tax? Are we going back to the gold standard? What would that mean exactly?
I mean, I would do all of those things if we could. And I think that would be more than any one administration could do in 4 or 8 years. But that's certainly the North Star principles we're looking for. At the bare minimum, we need to balance our budget so we're not spending more than we're taking in, printing extra trillions of dollars, using the Fed to basically have to provide more money into the economy overall, and having the Treasury print that money and basically devalue the dollar that we have. So that would be the bare minimum first step, is to at least get ourselves to a balanced budget. Then you want to start removing all deductions and subsidies and all these giveaways in the economy that allows our government to be picking the winners and losers through central planning and actually having a competitive free market. And you continue to cut government down to size as you do that. And ultimately, we want the government to not be picking winners and losers and creating as much condition as possible for people to be able to start a business, run a business, and not be unduly affected by the government in the process of doing so. Because that's where a lot of these jobs that should be getting created in our economy are getting stuck. It's because it's red tape and bureaucratic spending that gets in the way of that. And when you remove that factor, you allow for more resources to be allocated across the marketplace that can ultimately grow businesses, grow jobs, and create more prosperity, and not government prosperity. Individual human prosperity, business prosperity. And that's what we need. And that's why I've always supported just completely flattening the tax rate out as much as possible. I would like to remove all taxes, but at the bare minimum, let's get rid of every subsidy and deduction that we can, and overall just flatten that tax rate as much as possible to create a more competitive environment. And then keep working on the government, cutting it down to size, and you keep cutting the taxation. The biggest thing is we cannot cut taxes until we cut spending, because if we cut one and not the other, we just create that back-end tax of inflation on each and every person. And that affects the working people the hardest because they're the ones hardest hit by inflation. And so my economic practices would be balancing the budget, removing subsidies and deduction, flattening our tax code, and continuing to cut spending so we can continue to cut taxes until we ultimately can get ourselves fully removed from the income tax. And as far as tariffs and protectionism, remove all of those barriers to the free market, let ourselves import and export the way the market determines and the way our government does.
Going off of that, what is your stance on the regulations that are currently put on business in terms of licensing, of different, various regulations as far as how they should run the business, of how they have to be structured? How extensive do you think that these regulations should be?
Well, I think most of those you can be removing from the federal level. If they're going to be in place, it should be mostly at the local or at best, at most the state level, a lot of these things. But a lot of this can be fully removed from the realm of the federal government. And a lot of it can be fully removed from the marketplace altogether. If you remove things like tort caps and things like that, you'd have the judicial branch helping to hold people responsible, because you could sue people in court and bankrupt them if they do real wrong to you. But we don't need a lot of these licensures. I always liken it to when I was working in restaurants. I had to pay $35 a year for a pouring license so I could pour beer. Did they test on how well I could pour beer, or if I was doing anything to spot a fake ID? Or no, they just said pay the state $35 a year. You're not allowed to serve beer. That seemed to be is pretty arbitrary, and there's tons of licensure issues, particularly at the local level like that. In Georgia, I think it's $150 a year you have to pay to be a fortune teller. Nobody saw that coming, right? But to me, that is ridiculous. Why do you need to pay $150 to read somebody's tarot? Like, that's just very stupid. And again, there's no test that the government's giving to make sure you're telling fortunes well. There's no way to know. So, let's remove the government's hand from everything across from the tippy top to these kind of local licensure issues, things like certificate of need laws. I could go all day long, and all the levels of bureaucracy we need to get rid of in the market.
In that case, then, since we are approaching the end, I do want to press you on an issue that I think is important to a lot of libertarians out there. And if we speak about Murray Rothbard, anarcho-capitalism, a stateless, market society, I understand that, coming out and saying that you support, anarchism might be a bit of an extreme statement for, political candidate running for office. But I think, in this case, we should naturally try to lean more towards what is being truthful and sticking to principles here. So in that case, what is your stance on anarchism? Do you believe that there is value to an anarchist society?
Listen, so I myself am an anarchist, which is about as close as you can be with still having an existing state. I find anarchists to be very valuable in our movement, and I have many long ideological discussions. I say many of my favorite conversations over scotch is with anarchists describing anarchism versus minarchism and having that very long debate. I find it to be a valuable resource and a lot of that North Star kind of thinking. And hey, I'm a minarchist. If we cut down the state to where we get to the level of minarchy and I want to keep cutting, well, then at that point, I've become an anarchist. And so I say, let's keep cutting down the state together until we get to that point. And then if we disagree, well, that's when the Scotch-laden arguments are no longer that, and they become true political divisions. But until that happens, let's join together to reduce the size and scope of the state. Happily have many anarchist friends. And, we will continue to have those debates and those discussions as we continue to tear down the state together and fight for the liberty of all people. And maybe we get to minarchy and I say, you guys were right. And maybe we get to minarchy and they say I was right. Who knows? But until we get to like the level of the state being reduced, there's no use in us hating on each other or arguing against one another. Let's form ourselves together and continue to tear down the state brick by brick as much as possible.
You're not opposed to anarcho-capitalism necessarily. It's just that at the moment you consider yourself to be, simply a minarchist. But you do see anarchism. You do seem to see some level of value in that, though, from what you're telling me.
Absolutely. If for no other reason than debates with anarchists allow me to keep my minarchism sharp and poised and focused. And so, if anything, they're a valuable part of the movement because they're a valuable philosophical discussion to be having, and they're about reduction of the state. So I'm not going to hate on it. So let's work together.
In that case, I have one final question for you, and that is, what do you expect the outcome of this election to be? And I mean that not just in terms of who gets elected, but also the consequences of this winner's policies.
I honestly think no matter who wins between Trump or Harris, we're going to have more debts and deficits. We're probably going to have more warfare state around the world. And so the things that matter the most to me, I think there's not going to be much difference. I think regardless of which of those two might win, if one of the two wins, we're still going to be extremely divided. Like, it's not going to be pretty. I think no matter who comes out on top on November the 5th, there's going to be very angry people about it. And so my hope is that we can move beyond this election and hopefully, not just hate on each other so much. Like, I really am tired of people going to war at their Thanksgiving dinner. Maybe that's because we're just this false binary. And if we bring more voices in, we have less arguments to make. So, that's my hope, is that people wake up after this election how shitty it is, because, to pardon my French, that's what it's going to be like whether Trump or Harris wins. I think regardless of which of them were to win, if they do, I'm going to find things that I can maybe, hopefully one or two things that I can agree or applaud that they might do in the next 4 years. And I imagine there will be very many things that I have to criticize about both.
An unfortunate, but very likely true prediction of what is to come, and something that, may have very negative consequences, but, I know that as libertarians, we can stick to our principles and still try to find the best in whatever happens. So in that case, I do just want to wrap up by saying, thank you for appearing on the show, Chase, and thanks to everybody for listening in. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye. Make sure to follow Chase Oliver and follow his presidential campaign. I do know that it's easy to think that one's own vote is negligible, but enough individual third-party votes grouped together are going to, at the very least, send a message to the people in power. So with that said, make sure to subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. Everybody out there, have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.